Within this past year, we've had a changing of the guard of the historian's position in Round Lake. We had Bill Ryan was historian for 40, 50 years. So he's retired. And we have Lance Spallholz, which is the new Round Lake historian. I am assistant to him. Been here, Lance, 1973.
Yeah.
Lance and Norma.
Yeah, December makes 50 years for us.
So.
Yeah, been in Round Lake 50 years. As Scott said, when he arrived, he was I think a 3-year-old with his family, and he grew up here. And Norma and I moved here, I think, when I was 27, and I grew up here. So it's been a wonderful place to live, and I hope that we can share some of the history of Round Lake with you folks today. What are you going to see today? Well, number one, you're going to see a lot of nothing, because we're going to show you the places that buildings were that have disappeared. And then you're going to see a lot of homes that people are taking care of, they're improving, they're working on, and they love to be here in the village. And 3, we'll hope to show you how much fun it is to be here in Round Lake and to walk around. Okay? Now, the other warning is our streets are our sidewalks. They were horse and buggy wagon trails when the village was formed, and so there'll be traffic, and you may have to be aware a little bit of the traffic as we walk around. If a Round Lake resident drives up, they'll understand, they'll slow down, they'll let you get out of the way. But there are a lot of visitors, so be careful. You're standing where the train station was. The train station was built in 1873. The Zinsmith Trail was the railroad line between Troy, Albany, and Saratoga. And when the Round Lake Camp meeting was started, this became an ideal place because the train agreed to stop, and the lake was just on the other side of this property, and so it was a wonderful place. So the train station was here. It was built in 1873. It was torn down in 1958. Well, this is the George West house, and George West is from Balsam Spa. If you're in Balsam Spa, you're going up the main highway, large former factory there. If you look up high, I believe it still says George West up there. George West was a manufacturer. He made paper bags up there, and you'll hear more about George West a little bit later in the tour. But this is his second cottage. His first cottage was near the auditorium, and it was burned during the fire, and you're going to hear me talk about the fire many, many times as we go through the tour. So this is Albany Avenue. I think what stop is this on the? This is number 6, I guess. When Round Lake was first created as a camp meeting ground, 1868, 1869, it was all tents that were being used, but very quickly cottages were being built, and the first small cottages were built in 1872. So I think coming down this street particularly gives you an idea of small cottages, lots of good-looking architecture close together. And I said that we would mention a fire several times, and this is one place I'll mention it. You can understand that in the early 1900s, if a fire started in these buildings that were so close together, that there could be a problem in saving them. And so we're lucky to have a fire chief with us who's keeping a watch out for us. But this just gives you an idea of the clustering that could happen with the cottages. It's also one of the few places in the village, you'll notice, where the cottages face each other across the street. as you walk around, you can start noticing that most of the places that we'll see, houses will have an open green space in front of them. Part of the reason is there are buildings that have been lost, but part of the reason is that's part of the design. Gives you, even if you're in a small house, it gives you a feel of airiness. So this is Lake Avenue, and when you get a chance to be here for a second, look down the street. We were down there where the train station was. There's a picture on your phone going up Lake Avenue that actually you could see the train station at the end. Right. The other thing to note here on the instructions on the phone, I say, when you're walking around, look for buildings that still have their slate roofs, and also look for patterns in the slate. Here's a good example on the tower behind me, and they say that a slate roof lasts 100 years, and the slate roof on my house is about 150 years old now, so they work. The other thing to note about this location, the good place is, the farther we get away from the auditorium, the bigger the houses get. So the older cottages were built close to the auditorium. As the village transitioned into a year-round location, the bigger houses got built farther and farther away. Not always true, but it's a general rule. Now, all I'm going to do is step across over here. This beautiful lawn, now a park, is where the Hotel the Flowery Orient was built. The Flowery Orient was built in 1880. It was a hotel that had about 50 rooms. There's a picture available that shows the hotel staff numbering around 25 people gathered out in the porch. So the yard that's hidden behind the bushes and trees here, it's an open yard now, of course, but it is the site of Kennedy Hall. Now, Round Lake was going through a transition in the late 1870s, early 1880s, and they were moving from what had been the camp meeting paradigm for the religious meetings, and they were moving to a schooling paradigm. And so buildings were being built where schools would be available, where students that were coming here would have a place to stay. Kennedy Hall was one of those buildings that was built to house students. All right, so Kennedy Hall was here. So the Orient Hotel, Kennedy Hall here were neighbors. The Orient was torn down in 1956, and Kennedy Hall was torn down in 1962. Right. Across the street here is Alumni Hall, and the current owner has been extremely nice to put a label on it. But of course the label has been there since it was built. The alumni were the students that had come to some of the early summer schools, and they built the building. The building was used for administrative purposes for a while. It was used for visiting preachers that were coming to teach and to hold meetings as a sleepover location. It later was turned into a nursery school. It was a nursery. Paul, did you go to the nursery school?
I, in fact, did go to the musical nursery school, yes.
Right, and my son is also a musical school graduate. And then later on, it's been converted to 3 apartments, so it's 3 apartments there now, 2 on the first floor and 1 on the second floor. And it was built in 1884. And what's on your map, if you're looking at your map, Garnsey Hall number 11 is really off our track. We're not going to go past where it is, but again, it's empty space now, but it was built over there, and it was the girls' residence for these schools that were taking place. So if you've read ahead, you see the historic marker there. On the corner of this park lawn is where the George West Museum of Art and Architecture stood. The George West Museum was built in 1887, and if you've looked at the pictures, it was probably, I would consider, the most magnificent building that was built here in Round Lake. And it was used as an art and museum for a lot of years. At one point, near the end of its life, it had a large collection of Ulysses S. Grant memorabilia. Remember Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, died up in Gansford at the Grant Cottage, and he is noted to have stopped by Round Lake once when the train stopped. And the addendum to the story that I've been told is he left because drinking was not allowed. Anyway, it had a large art collection. It operated as a museum until 1919, and it was closed as a museum. And at that point, the building was turned over to the local school district. It was used as a school for Round Lake residents primarily, and for a number of years. And eventually, when Shenendehowa was formed and started, it was used as the high school for Shenendehowa for a couple of years. The first superintendent of schools for Shenendehowa, Rodney Winans, was a Round Lake resident, and Neil Hessen was a local lawyer, and he is the lawyer that put together the paperwork to form the Shenendehowa School District. If you know the Shenendehowa School District at all, if you look at a map, it is essentially a big rectangle, and in the upper right-hand corner of that rectangle is Round Lake. And when Shenendehowa was formed, the largest population concentration in the district was Round Lake. Anything to add, Scott?
I mean, we did talk about Garnsey Hall where we missed it. So if you were to follow it straight down this way on the right-hand side of Garnsey Hall, did you mention the Octagon House?
Oh no, I didn't. Octagon House is what, number 12. There's a picture on your phone taken years ago where you could look straight down the street and see the Octagon House sitting there. That's on the phone. Octagon House is still there, so there's also a modern picture of the house. The house that's in the older picture that stood here in this yard, obviously is no longer there. The other thing to note here, I mentioned the slate roofs before, and a couple good examples of slate roofs here with patterns. I think on the other side, the Sweets have a pattern, and the Sweets' daughter that lives over here has a pattern in that slate roof. Here's a look around spot on the map, and what you can see over there is the lake, and so we're not very far away, and obviously when the leaves are gone it's a lot better view. Thing to point out about this house is the front half of the second story, where you see the slate changing, is an addition. It was done maybe 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. But again, what I'm trying to point out is people that move here often have high respect for what they've gotten into, and they need to make changes, but they make changes appropriately. The house over there, again, was a small cottage has been added to nicely with screened-in porches. And one thing I failed to mention is that as you're walking around, you'll notice the paper lanterns hanging on many houses. They are a result of the night of illumination, which takes place in the village at the time of the Antiques Festival. When we get into the community center, we'll have some more time to talk about that. But the lanterns are left up by many people in maybe all the ones they've got, maybe some of the ones they've got, but they are a result of the night of illumination that's been a tradition in the village now for 16, 18 years. 18 years? About 18 years, Scott, for night of illumination? 17, okay. Now, as another look around stop, the thing to note primarily from this location is the roof of the auditorium. So we are in this pattern of walking around the center of the village. The roof of the auditorium is over there. We'll get there eventually, I hope. The gray house over here is believed to be the last remaining first cottage to be built. It may not have been actually the first one, but it was in the first group. And the additions that have been done, again, a good friend of mine lives there. This is the third house in the village he's owned. He's done the additions to house family members that needed to move in. And he is also the owner of this house, which, if you'd been here 3-4 months ago, you would have wondered how it stood. But he's working on it, doing a wonderful job. Here for 2 stops. 17, which is ahead of us, I'll speak about that in a minute. 16 is the Tin Cottage, which is not on the trail. If you look through the leaves over here, you can probably see a tin roof, and that's the Tin Cottage that's down there. As it explains here on your phone, if you've been looking, early cottages that were built here in Round Lake were often built from kits. The owners would order a cottage kit from Sears, and it would get delivered, it would get assembled and put together for their cottage, of course, summer work. Tin cottages were one of those kits that could be ordered. That cottage is the only tin cottage remaining in the village. It was located on one of the streets up near where the train station is, where we started it, and it was moved down here by our good friends Paul and Diane Marchand. Paul used it as his architecture office, and his wife continues to use it, I think, that way. But it's down there. I've got it off the beaten path. Didn't want everybody to walk downhill and walk back up. If you're interested, you can return another time. The houses, the house, I should say, above, gentleman just reminded me that on the walking tour that took place this past June, this was one of the stops on the walking tour. Again, I'll point out the slate roofs, the colored glass, what I guess I haven't mentioned before. But this building was actually 2 cottages. And those 2 cottages were located here where this empty space is. And they were moved across the street, joined together to create the house that you see there now. Somewhere in the middle of the Methodist church lawn, before the Methodist church was there, a geologist had come to the village and said, you know, Saratoga is not very far away, and there are a lot of springs up there. So I'll bet we can find a spring here in Round Lake. And so they started digging. 1,403 feet later, they found a spring. and according to all accounts, it was wonderful. The taste was great. The temperature was 50 degrees, which you can imagine being very refreshing without normal refrigeration. And they built a gazebo over it. The picture is on your phone. And it was bottled and sold. And it lasted for, according to my notes, it lasted for about 25 years. There was an effort to improve the flow, and they ruined it. So it is gone. All right. Over here, this building is now a private home, but it is also the Windsor Hotel. It was built in 1895, and if you look at the picture of your phone, the picture makes it look twice as big, and that's because it was twice as big. The north half of the building burned. The southern part, which we see here now, was saved and made into a home. What we don't see over here in the church parking lot is the Wentworth Hotel. The Wentworth Hotel was probably the biggest hotel in the village. It was 3 stories tall. It was built in 1878, and it was destroyed by fire in 1933. So we now see an empty lot. Farther down the street over there is Griffith's Institute. As I said before, there was a transition going to teaching school. The Griffith's Institute was built as a school, had study rooms, had assembly room, purely a very nice building, brick. It was built in 1878 as the transition was taking place, and it was destroyed, 1887, and it was brought down in 1946. And farther on in that direction still stands the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church was built in 1892, typical for, I guess, Episcopal Church is built in the form of a cross, still used for Sunday services. Beautiful on the inside if you get a chance to get in. Still there. One thing to note, the Methodist Church was built in 1894, so the Episcopal Church is actually 2 years older than Methodist Church. And the question becomes, if it's a Methodist camp meeting ground, how is it the Episcopals get to church first? Well, the Methodists had the auditorium, and they had a place to gather and worship. And then finally, I guess, they decided they need to have a church built, and they built the church. Again, lovely inside if you get a chance to get inside. Before 1921, on this site was a building called the Arcade. The Arcade had 2 halves. The north half is here, where this building is. There were archways across First Street, which runs down in front of those cottages, and into the south portion, which is over there on what is now called Library Lawn. The arcade held things like the post office, a bakery, chocolate shop, clothing store. It was a mini mall for the time. And at 4 a.m. on July 11th, 1921, it is believed that in the bakery, the fire started. It took out the arcade. It took out 3 cottages that were next to the arcade on that lawn, and it took out 10 cottages that were down the row park. And the story is the shifting of the wind prevented the fire from spreading further. And it's called the $200,000 fire, but 16 cottages and the arcade. So this building was built to replace essentially the arcade. This now has the village offices, the post office, a lawyer's office upstairs. Fortunately, I don't know who that is. But anyway, so that's why we had this big open space. 10, 15 years ago or so, the Veterans Memorial was added by the village. If you get a chance to walk over there, the bricks that are in the walkway are the names of Round Lake residents or Round Lake families that served in the armed forces, and they're identified there. What else can I mention here? The arcade was built in 1886, and as I said, destroyed along with the other 16 cottages in 1921. The interesting thing about the organ, it's older than the village. The organ was built in 1848 for a church in New York City. The association was formed in 1868 here. The roof for this end of the building was put up in 1885. The organ was purchased by the association, dismantled into church in New York City that was selling it, brought up here by both barge and probably railroad, and reassembled. The end of the auditorium was built and the organ was reassembled inside of it. If you look up above me, you'll see that the structure across here and here are all iron rod, and then they become wooden. And so you can tell the addition by the change in the structure that's holding up the roof. And so that addition was built to house the organ. It has something like 1,900 pipes. And just fun to, as I said to a few people when we walked by my first house, which is over here, I said, when I was painting as a new resident and someone active to get his house in shape, I got to listen to rehearsal after rehearsal after rehearsal during the week as the organist would come in. It was a lot of fun. Also around the outside of the building here, you'll see posters. I think if we start over here and follow your way around, they give a history of organs in Methodist Camp meeting grounds, or the organs as important to religious meetings early in the 1800s, and then coming around to this organ arriving at Round Lake. One of the residents here in the village did a 4 years worth of research to find out about all this to make the organ eligible for national recognition. I mentioned Night of Illumination several times. One of the events of the Night of Illumination is for the village to recognize a resident who has been an active contributor to the village in many ways, either politically or physically or being on boards or whatever. But that is one of the high points. Again, you see lanterns here. This group up there are what are called the commemorative lanterns. They each have a tag which says what year they're involved with, and they go from left to right. So each person who's an honoree, in effect, has a commemorative lantern associated with him or her.